For those of you I haven't met, my name is Rebecca McDuff and I'm the Gallery Director for Bundaberg Regional Galleries. And it's my honour to have artist and good friend Dylan Sarra here tonight to speak about his arts practice and the connection to the Burnett River Rocks. So I'm going to pass over to Dylan. Thank you.
Thank you, Beck. Can I just say that, can you guys hear me all right up the back there? Yep. Can I just say that I've given this talk now probably about 6 or 7 times, and this would have to be the most nervous I've actually ever felt to present this. And the reason is because this research and this place where we are right now is really, really special to me. And the fact that I've got family here and also other people that are interested in this subject, and we're all here together in this space, it really means a lot. So the nerves are slowly tapering down as the more I speak. But as customary with different events, we always do a welcome to country. We hear that generally with every event. When I've been asked to give a welcome, I try to make it meaningful. For me, this country is my place. So I belong to this place and this place belongs to me. And the reason for that is because this is the home of my family. And for many generations, we've walked all over this land. We've walked the foundations before this building was even here. No doubtedly straight down the riverside through this spot as it is. We don't give that much thought because we're surrounded by roads and concrete. But at this point, I'm going to take you back on a little journey and I want you to think about our existence and what that means to people like myself and my family. So on that note, I'd like to welcome you into this space on behalf of not just the Bundaberg Regional Gallery, but also to me personally and my family. Acknowledgements. This part is a little bit emotional for me, but I get through it. This is my grandmother. She lived at Whitred Street. She raised a lot of kids. She had an Italian immigrant as a father, and she did a damn good job with what she had. The reason I'm here doing that is because of the legacy that she left behind. Everything that she stood for, I also stand for. Her values, her sense of community, helping others in need, and showing love to everybody was her to the core. And I'd like to think that this talk, as I give it, is honouring her memory, but not only her memory, the people that instilled those values in her as well. People, unfortunately, that I never got to meet. But in some ways, through this research and as I do this presentation, I do feel connected. And I do feel connected to my family and my place. So on that note again, I welcome you here and let's get started. Also customary are our acknowledgements. Now, I'm not going to say this by rote. I'm not going to acknowledge the traditional owners. I'm not going to do any of those things. Again, for me, this is a really personal thing. I pay my respects to those who have walked this country before my existence. That's my ancestors. I pay my respects to those who are the descendants of the original custodians that are actively sharing and promoting our culture. That's people that are working alongside with me. I represent a generation that you've got my grandmother's generation, then you have my father's generation and mine. I'm of a generation where I want to understand the trauma. I want to understand and be curious about what actually happened in the past and how does that look? How does that look through an arts practice? And that's why I say that. I pay my respects to all who are listening with an open heart and continue to embrace our true history and listen to the truth. And that's pretty much every single person in here tonight. So again, I'm grateful for everybody to be here, and let's get started. So I was born here. I lived in Gladstone for most of my schooling life. My family still living here. And I was in and out of, well, I finished my school and then I was in and out of various jobs. And long story short, because I've got to keep this on time, I basically ended up in the university system. I was working with young kids at the time in the classroom, and I found that there was, as an Indigenous teacher aide, I was getting palmed to kids who were deemed not to be keeping up with the rest of the class, or troublemakers or misfits. I made it my mission to work with some of these kids and actually use art as a form to reinvent the way that we learn. Something as simple as using art to help a child that's not been attending school to turn him around and use art to write his name in the matter of a week was something where I had a massive light bulb moment and I went, there's something in this. Unfortunately, I didn't get to keep that job at the school and I was encouraged to go back to university. When I went into university, I studied the Contemporary Indigenous Arts course through Griffith University, and I was encouraged to go there by somebody I call a good friend now, Judy Watson, who's been a pioneer female artist for a very long time, and she was the one that encouraged me to go back into the classroom. So begrudgingly I did. Then I stepped in there, I found that this place was, all of a sudden I was surrounded by my people. And the CAI program is unique in that it sits with the university, but the sense of community that radiates out of the CAI Contemporary Arts classroom is electric. And it's had most prominent senior artists pass through there, it's had new people come through, but the thing that stands out is there's always a sense of community and everybody loves to spend time there. So as you're spending time there, you can imagine the ideas and the conversations that are happening both past, present and future. In that course, I was told that we had to first look, in our first year we were experimenting with different arts, but we had to get familiar with our story. Now in that, with my story, I knew bits and pieces and they sat in different parts of my mind, but they never actually really gelled and they never really came together with a true sense of identity, that it was a sense of meaningful, and that I could translate this into an art form to express my history. So we started looking at the Burnett River petroglyphs. Now this was a story that I was kind of familiar with, and I'd heard mentions about the rocks, but never really knew too much about it. And it wasn't until a moment, which I'll talk about later on, that this actually really started to pique my interest, because by what I was able to see on some of these rocks as the story progresses, it really started to solidify my story, my country, my people, and where we are here today. This journey, can everybody see that? Yep, you guys can see it all right? Where that yellow circle is, does anybody know where that is? See, just cross it. So as the crow flies from here, we're about 23 k's up the river. And there was a bend in that river. And in the bend of that river was a large sandstone outcrop that sat at the base of the river, or to the side of the riverbed. And its size was about 3.5 square kilometres. Now to put that in perspective, we're looking at the area of half a football field, covered in sandstone. Just adjacent to Pine Creek, you can see it, this is an aerial shot, and this was actually taken by the Queensland Air Force back in the day, when the area was going to be surveyed. Because what needed to happen was, needed to be irrigation systems put in, dam walls, and it was a concern that this site of sandstone would be submerged. Now the reason there was a concern was because the whole site was covered in petroglyphs. Aboriginal carvings into sandstone that who knows how old they are, we still don't know. Generations and generations and layers of knowledge and story literally carved into the stone. Now who here knows their story? There's not too many hands going up. Every time I've done this, or I've done some type of presentation here, we have people turn around and say, I've lived here my whole life and I've never heard this. I'm second generation, I've never heard this story. So 3.5 square kilometres of sandstone covered in carvings, and not just random carvings, but collections. So imagine symbols sitting among other symbols and layered over the top, very similar to the way that we see the Carnarvon Gorge art stencils on the wall. It's the same principle, but applied to a rock. So as I said before, what was needed to happen was that they wanted to siphon some of the water off. They needed to conserve the water off the river, and feed the surrounding agriculture. And basically, these rocks were in the way. So this is a newspaper article that I found in the archives from the Bundy Newsmate. And the title says, Native Art in Path of District Progress. So knowing what we know now about Indigenous issues, cultural issues, people, all of those sorts of things, back here, which is roughly around about 1970 at this point, it was non-existent. So going back to this image here, there was an archaeologist who was fought for their protection, and her name was Kate Sutcliffe. Now, I haven't decided personally if she's a good guy, a bad guy, a victim of circumstance. I haven't quite discerned where she sits, but the one thing I am towards her and what she's done is empathetic, and I want to explain to you why. So I want you to think about, there's a few slightly older faces than mine in the room. It's probably a nice way to put it. Who remembers the politics of about 1975 and all the way through the 80s?
Oh, yes.
The Joh Bjelke-Petersen era. That's what we're talking about. This is a female archaeologist, quite senior, in a male-dominated industry, working under a corrupt government. And she fought for their protection. There were actually 4 or 5 projects going on at the time, and she was adamant that this site needed to be saved. Now, the Queensland government, in some ways, originally they just wanted to demolish the site, go over the top of it, out of sight, out of mind. But she used the Cultural Heritage Protection Act, which was in place at the time, to fight for their protection. Now, as this story again, as it develops, that's her in the photo. Okay. She has no family, she never married, no kids, no contacts. And basically, after this project, I feel, personally, that it broke her. She went into hiding, and she's not been found since, other than a few whispers that people know the general location where she lives. And again, when you can see the task that she was faced with, and the very little support that she got, it's any wonder that she actually decided to pack it all in and go into hiding, basically. So the Queensland government said, all right, we've got the Cultural Heritage Protection Act in place, do what needs to be done, we'll give you very little money, we'll give you very little time, go in there and document as much as you can, and get out. And so 1971 was when they physically started going to the site to record the data that was there. Now, it's a bit primitive in the way that they did it, but basically what they did was, if I go back, in that image you can see a plastic sheet sort of hanging off the rock. So her and a couple of other people had to cover this whole site, and they put plastic sheets over the top of the rocks, and they traced what they could see. Now that's really important. I want you to remember that they could trace what they see, because we'll come back to that. But basically, as they were doing all of these tracings, I've got a record now of probably over 300 of these. And they're absolutely amazing. I look at them, and then I don't look at them. And then I look at them a bit more, and every time I revisit this, there's a lifetime of inspiration in here for me. Because symbolically, with iconography, we want to attach meaning. What's the meaning of this? What's the context of this? What's this saying about the location? What's this saying about me? What's this saying about my family? Now, some of that you may think looks Indigenous. Some of it, again, we look at this and we try to find some type of interpretation. The more I go through it and I see some of these collections together, I see maps, I see people, I see stars, and I see the landscape. And I feel that the artwork is interpreting and talking about different stories at different times, at different places. Another example. Now, some of these rocks are quite large, the ones that were removed. Some of them were quite small. This is the site now where we're at. I should actually mention too, and I didn't say this at the start, I apologise, but there is a disclaimer with this. I am showing footage that may deem culturally hurtful. But also too, I'd like to recognise and acknowledge the fact that this is absolutely important to show these images and show this video so that people get an understanding of what it is that we're dealing with and why it's so important. So for the purpose of this research, it's deemed appropriate. So this site is where it is now. And you can see, I got to experience this 2 years ago, I suppose, with my cousin. And the place itself is just this most, I don't even know how to describe it. It's probably the most serene, comforting setting that I've stood at and thought, that's why they chose this place. Because it's in the bend of two bends of a river, and you're surrounded by trees. You've got an amazing view of the sky, the landscape. And it's also too got other trees that sit around there which were sources of food for campsites and things like that as well. This is footage that I found when I started my research. This is actually what was going on. So this I think was recorded in 1971, just prior to the excavation. And what they did was they put a call out for helpers. There's actually one elder, a community member that's lives here in Bundaberg, Uncle Mickey. He was part of this extraction process. But also too, when I looked through the other photos, the other helpers were mostly kids. So, which is what you'll see here. They're shoveling sand and moving the sand away from the rocks so that they can get a fair idea of the site and what they're actually dealing with. Now you can see like the marks in this video are really clear, and apparently they were even more plentiful and more visible prior to this. But water being abrasive and sitting in the river, and the river floods and all the rest of it, as the water passes over the rock, they eventually start to fade away. So as they're doing this, they separate not the whole site. They document most of the site, but then they select a few pieces, 92 stones, and then they selected them and they literally put the drill through, like a perforation through the rock, and they snapped them, and they were then lifted and taken away. I'll just let this one play out and you'll get a better idea of what we're talking about. So they were broken up and removed from the site. 94 stones were removed. Some of them weighing up to 5 or 6 tonnes, others quite significantly small. They then put them on a flatbed train, and this is where it starts to get messy. Because of the time and resources that the archaeologist was allowed, there was no plan after that they were removed. As a result, they ended up scattered all over Queensland. Some of them are still here in Bundaberg. Some of them are still sitting in a garden, just like this photo. Some of them are sitting in a holding place that needs to be replaced. Some of them are sitting at UQ University, some of them are sitting at Griffith. So it was an act of desperation over a period of time, the next couple of years, to do something with these rocks. As you can see in this image, some of them never even left the waterboard depot. And there they sat, and exposed to the elements. Sandstone exposes and contracts, and fractures. So the care of these rocks was not taken into consideration at all, let alone what was on them. In this journey of doing this research, I found a file within the Queensland Archives. Now, I don't know if anybody's had the experience of researching with the Queensland Archives, but it's a hell of a beast. And there's so much information, and it sits at so many different levels and so many different layers. To find anything, you need all the help in the world to get it. But I was encouraged to go and have a look, and I sat down at my desktop and I was looking through all these different combinations, Bundaberg, petroglyphs, rock carvings, this, and nothing was coming up. Then I found this file that said Bundaberg excavations. Now remember, like in that scope, you've got civil works that have been recorded, road development, history, it's just this tiny inconspicuous title that said Bundaberg excavations. And it made me pique my interest because I looked at the dates, and the dates kind of matched up. And I put a request in to see it, and there was a block on it till 2043. So I couldn't actually access the file. So what I did was I sent an email through, and I said, look, this is who I am. I'm a research student. I work contemporary art student. I also am a traditional owner from Bundaberg. I feel like this story implies to me. Can you at least just send me some information and tell me what's in the file? And I'll never forget it. Probably months later, we were setting up the Cairns Indigenous Arts Fair, and it was a quiet period, and there were no people, nobody was coming through, and I got an email and I opened it up, and it was a response by the Queensland Archives, and they sent me the file. And I opened up the file, and in the file was every single letter of correspondence that happened between all parties pertaining to the rocks. And now I have this physical record of following through the sequence of events of what happened, when it happened, how it happened, what were the attitudes that were attached around that. And to be honest, I'm still trying to digest it. But I think this is a letter which we can't really see, but it's a letter that I felt like it really highlighted the issues that we're dealing with. This was a correspondence between the Solicitor General, the Treasury Building, with a letter from Kate Sutton. I'll read it to you. Dear Sir, within the terms of the Aboriginal Relics Preservation Act of 1967, Section 13 provides that relics, as defined in Section 3 of the above Act, shall be property of the Crown. Recently, the Archaeological Division of this department was involved in a joint venture with officers of the Irrigation and Water Supply Commission in a unique rescue operation of rock carvings from the bed of the Burnett River, shortly to be inundated following the construction of a large dam at Sarra Burnett. So remember the word protection. The result of the operation was that 94 individual rocks weighing from 2 to 5 tonne were drilled and lifted from the riverbed and stored at Bundaberg. The exercise naturally created considerable interest from local authorities, historical societies and private individuals. I write to you now regarding the last mentioned persons, particularly a Mr. and Mrs. O'Murran of Lyons Road, South Gooreng. Does anybody know them? They ran mystery traders. I was wondering if anybody knew that. So this is a letter on their behalf. South Gooreng will open a tourist attraction on their property, which admission will be charged to visit some unique crater areas on their property. Mr. and Mrs. Murran have approached the Honourable Hewitt, Minister for Conservation, Marine and Aboriginal Affairs, to allow a number of the engravings to be suitably placed on their property as an additional interest being part of the history of the area. So I feel that's a good nature. They're doing this for the right reason. The Honourable, the Minister has agreed in principle to the proposal, but with definite reservations, bearing in mind the commercial nature of their operation, that the engravings be available for viewing to the general public at no charge. They're just too kind, aren't they? The Murrins have readily agreed that the proposal and attached is a copy of their letter and a sketch plan of the proposed location. To ensure that at no time in the future the rocks are commercially exploited or the public debarred access, perhaps through failure of the venture or subsequent sale of the property, it is desired that an agreement be drawn up between the Crown and Mr and Mrs Murrin to ensure that the spirit of the agreement is maintained and the relics at any time may be removed from the property if deemed necessary. While Section 18 of the Act clearly provides adequate protection for the relics, the commercial nature of the venture, the first of this type of arrangement in Queensland, warrants the execution or an appropriate agreement. All rock engravings will be cross-referenced and the departmental archaeologist will make a select of suitable places to be displayed. Your assistance is sought thereafter to prepare an agreement to protect the interest of the Crown. Now, at what point did we hear the mention of consultation with the traditional owners? There was none. They just went ahead and did it. And so, as a result, we've got a fractured nature of our people, our identity, our sense of place, the stories that connected to that. All of a sudden, a big section of that is gone. And not only is it gone, but it wasn't done. Well, I didn't know anything about it. Well, I wasn't born, but there was conversation and rumours around the track, but there was no actual sitting down at the table and having a conversation with the traditional owners. It didn't exist. They just went ahead and did it. Now, this is where it's important for me. So going back to my university degree, I step into the classroom. Who are you? What's your story? What's your identity? Now, this frame probably sets up what my teachers call the light bulb or the lightning strike, where they saw me in the Queensland Museum and it was just like somebody flicked a switch. Leading up to that, I was a bit frail and lost and wasn't sure where my place was or what I was supposed to be doing or how I was doing it, and I was getting really discouraged because my classmates, Kyra Magdalo and Dylan Mooney, one's from Strait Island of Bundaberg, the other one's a Yui man from Mackay. We went to the museum and we had access to the archives at the back, and they brought these artefacts out from our country. And Kyra got to see these amazing dilly bags with beautiful stitching and very, just super impressive, but very localised to the Strait Island one. Dylan had the same experience with shields. He had shields with patterns on them and all that sort of stuff coming in. All I had was that up in the top corner there. They brought out 3 boomerangs. And they said, this is all we've got from your mob. Now, that might seem insignificant, and my heart did sink a little bit. Because you look at those top 2 boomerangs, they look like they were donated to the museum, probably to go into a gift shop or something like that. There wasn't much paperwork attached to them. But then there's that old boomerang sitting underneath it. Now, the experience was they picked the boomerang up and they put it in my hand. And as soon as they did that, there was a couple of things that happened in my head. Over here, my ancestor John Broome was a Bunda man. Now, Bunda had scarification marks of boomerangs across their chest. Now, that was there, up to 3 boomerangs carved on their upper torso. That was the first thing. But then also too, at this point I was like, I've heard about these rocks, and I remember this being a conversation, but I'd never really made any connection to it. Until I remember Uncle Willie Broome turning around and saying, hey, that story, them 3 boomerangs, that's on them rocks. Now again, those things sat in different parts of my mind, and it wasn't until the lady at the museum picked that boomerang up and put it in my hand that all of those things collided together. And all of a sudden I had this sense of purpose, and I knew I knew what I wanted to talk about. I knew what I wanted to say. And I'm still going on with that. One of the first works I created was a work called Let Me Speak. And what it was based off conversations that had sort of been happening around the fringes, and I wasn't too sure about who was saying what and what was being done and where all the rocks were and all these sorts of things. And I almost felt like personally that this was such an amazing topic with so many different layers, but it just been kind of left to the side a little bit. And I had the opportunity to present my first work into a NATSIAA, which is what we're going to be talking about with Beck. And basically what I did was I took the symbols that I understood that I'd seen out of various archive photos. I then physically carved 3 boomerangs and created an intaglio print. Now what that means is you carve an artefact, you layer it with ink, you lay the paper over the top, you feed it through a press, pull it back out, and when you peel the paper off the artefact, you're left with a direct replica, the representation of the ink surface. And then I started to apply some of these symbols over the top. And what was really interesting for me was like all these symbols at this point with the drawing I had all sat with no order. It was just this is over there and this is over there. There was no context other than just squiggly lines. But it was enough for me to go, you know what, I think this is really important. I want to create a work and it's going to speak, it's going to say something. And blow me down, it actually got accepted as a finalist. So that was my first year in the NATSIAA, which was really cool. But as this story developed for me, there were a couple of key things. As I was reading it and I was looking through the archaeologist and what she had written, I should actually mention too that as she was doing the research project and documenting everything, she was writing a thesis. Now it's documented that she was writing a thesis, but it was never ever published. And it was never ever published because she was told to stop. So there's an unpublished thesis somewhere. I'm imagining a little old lady sitting in her house on her bed, and then under that bed are boxes of information. 300 and 400 photos that are still unaccounted for. They're somewhere. There's other bits and pieces as well that I've found through my research. It's got to be somewhere, but nobody knows where that is, let alone have heard of it. But I did find this statement that Kate made, and she said, the salvage process and its problems and successes are covered in detail, but no analysis of the artwork was ever taken. One, because they probably didn't have the time, the money, or the resources, so they just had to do something, do it, get rid of it. So this is where my research starts. And one of the ways I've done this is I've gone back and I'm going to find all the pieces of the puzzle. Well, I'm trying really hard to anyway. And using that map, we can find what stones, because this is a hand-drawn map of the site, we can find what stones sat where, which way they pointed, is there information there, is there information missing, all of those sorts of things, and basically start putting this thing back together. It might be not physically, but it might be digitally. So, keeping in mind this is all about research, but also to the way I articulate my research is through an arts practice. And I had in mind a particular work that I wanted to make, but I never understood how I was going to produce the result that I wanted, that I had locked away in my ADD brain, and this is what it was going to do, and this is how it was going to work, and I was going to do it 100 miles an hour. None of that happened. Right? I walk into a shed, and it was like a morgue. There were rocks like this, and you can see there's white, like a white plastic protect them, just laying over the top, just waiting. And I went in there, and I ripped everything off, opened up the shed, let some air come through the place, and let's have a look at what we're seeing. And I think I was really disappointed because in my head, I knew this location was there, and I wanted to walk in, and I was like, this is going to blow everyone away, there's going to be all this amazing art, I don't know, I'm going to record it like this, I'm going to do it like that. But the reality was that when I peeled all the sheets off, there wasn't really much to see. So you stand there looking at that, and I'm like, I'm gutted. There's just bloody rocks. There's nothing there. Some of them were quite distinct, but most of them weren't. So I came up with this idea of recording the data another way. And I had different materials available to me at the time. And so what I did was I settled on muslin cloth. Now muslin has a beautiful ancient history of its own, but I associate muslin with like wrapping of babies and taking care. or healing a wound. So I felt that it was appropriate for me to use this material on the surface of this rock. But what actually happened was I traced out some of the ones that I could see, but then as I was doing that, I kind of put my hand down to the side with my charcoal to look at what I was doing, and I started doing that with my fingers. And I realised there was actually information there that I physically couldn't see. And so as I ran my hand over the surface of the material which was clinging to the rock, all of a sudden I could feel the marks of the old people. And potentially some of this stuff hadn't been recorded, so I was seeing it and feeling it for the very first time. And that, like, even now I get goosebumps when I relay that story, because it was such it was a very emotional, but it was like, wow, this is where I'm supposed to be and this is what I'm sort of supposed to be doing. This is an example of some of the motives that were coming up. Now again, I'm not sharing sacred knowledge, secret knowledge with anyone. We're just observing out of context symbols as they sat. And then I make associations with where I've seen some of this stuff in other areas of Australia. This is a classic example. So I've done an artwork of this where I've actually had it on display, and I've had another gentleman from Western Australia come and tell me, he says, you know what that is? I go, I've no idea. He says, well, for us, that is a cycle that tells a story about when the right time to go and hunt that particular species of animal on your country. He said, maybe here it's turtle. I'm like, no, it's definitely not turtle. But it was associated with weather cycles and periods of hunting. Now, weather cycles, in my research, I've actually found that there's another site that sits down just outside of Geelong, and it's called Wada Nuong. And what it is it's a rock arrangement. It's so big I could not find a proper photo of it, but the arrangement and the way that that sits is almost identical. So this is like a cone shape with a line that goes through the middle with several strategic rocks. So all of a sudden now we've got like this physical carving or drawing, and now I've got an association potentially with a rock arrangement. Is there a similarity? Are these feeding off the same story? I'm not too sure. But again, that's the whole point of this as being an artist. I get to go into the world of archaeology and all these sorts of things and look at things through a different lens. Now this is the image that I was referring to before, and this is an image that popped up during looking for further information at the Queensland Museum. This was a photograph that was donated to the Queensland Museum by Sir M. Nathan in 1924, I think it is. Now, it's quite significant because you've got a group of men, they're all painted up, they have scarification, and the information that we have is donated by Sir M. Nathan, Burnett River Rocks. Okay? Now, donated by Sir M. Nathan to me was important because at the time that he donated that photo, he was the Governor General of Queensland, and he was doing a tour through regional Queensland, and he was stopping at different places. We've got records of that. And I feel, personally, that this was one of the places that he stopped. There is a record of him here. And I would say that they've been asked to look at the natives and put on a performance for him before he moves on to the next town. I feel that that's what this photograph is actually all about. But when we look at this image, for cultural reasons I've blacked out their face, but I don't want you to focus on that. I want you to focus on the markings on their body. Right? This photo alone could have years and years of research done to it. There's so much information in there, it's not funny. In the background, up the top corner, you can just see the Burnett River. Around in the trees, there are carvings or scars in the tree. In the back corner, you've got a homestead, and there's two people standing there out there in the corner. You've got a gentleman here that has ferns in his head. There's ferns, the same ferns are down here in the corner. Burnett River Rocks, I would love to find where this photo was actually taken. I did a bit of investigating and sleuthing, and I know that it was taken roughly at about 12:30 on the northern side of the Burnett River. If you're interested, I can tell you how I did that later, but I've roughly worked out a rough location of where this photo was actually taken. Now, why is this image important? So I said to you before about a family relative, John Broom, with the boomerang scarf on his chest. Now that was an oral story that I just knew of. This was the first time that I'd actually seen it physically recorded as an image. You've got two men, one with two stripes and one with one. So that's the first thing. The next thing are the marks that are painted on their bodies. So you've got, again, the two Bunda men. They've got a line with 3 prongs that goes all the way up their arms, across their shoulders, over their nose, down the other side. It's one continuous line and joins up on the other side. Now, if you look at the prongs at the end of the hand, they are strokes of 3. Now, the archaeologists actually reported this as 2 inward-facing arrows with a line that connects them. They're actually emu speed. I'm not too sure what the line is or what that represents, but it's super important because now I've got an image that is called the Burnett River Blacks. They are Bunda men, and now there's an association between the markings on their body and the carvings in the rock. So this is an image that I took when I first started at Griffith University. This was just sitting in one of the rocks that we were in a garden, brushed all the leaves off it. This is what was underneath it. This is the original photo in its context before it was removed, and also too surrounded by other symbols. The next part of that image is this. Now again, I'm not too sure what this means, but what I'm about to tell you kind of makes sense to me. I have another associate, a good friend of mine, Warraba Weatherall, who's Kamilaroi country, and we've sat down and looked at these images and picked it apart. We still do it. Anyway, he talked about this line through the middle, which is what we call the power line. And the power line is that connection that is displayed on the human body to signify our relationship between sky stories, person, and landscape stories. And there's a connection with power being lightning. So he said, I've seen this before, and to me that has something to do with lightning or power that generates through the centre of the body. I'm like, oh, I've seen that before. This is a story called the Lightning Brothers in the Northern Territory. Now again, what I'm going on here is I'm trying to make you understand is that this site wasn't just for this site. This site was connected, like roads and towns, to other sites. And the stories and the iconography and the art went along those pathways. So this is a story called the Lightning Brothers. And there's the motive that's been painted down the centre of their chest. There it is carved in our rock. So now we're starting to take this out of not just Bundaberg, and it's important to Bundaberg, it's important because it's a piece that connects us to other places around Australia. West up to the Northern Territory, further west and right across, all the way down. Everybody and everything was connected. So currently where I'm at now, and with what I've been doing, is delving into the world of archaeology, looking at what technologies are available, and starting to play and experiment with that. One of those things is called photogrammetry, and what I've done, working with another lady, Andrea Gelladoni, who's a senior archaeologist at Gold Coast campus, she introduced me to photogrammetry because I was talking about my frustration. Surely in this day and age, in this technology, there's a better way to record this information than me sitting there for hours on end with a piece of cloth using charcoal. There has to be another way. And she said, well, have you tried photogrammetry? And so she introduced me to that. And what photogrammetry is I'm able to take a stone like that and x-ray it. Now, I've got a full picture of something that I previously couldn't see due to the condition of the rock. So if you remember that first photograph, it's covered in lichen. It's that thick that when I rub my hand over the top of it, I still can't feel anything because they're exposed and open to the elements. And lichen is a living, breathing organism and it's just doing its thing. But to be able to use a non-invasive technology where we can get a better understanding of the rocks and x-ray them and get this information off them makes that goal of mine to be able to put all the pieces back together and put it all back into context just that little bit more achievable. And not only achievable, but more accessible. So I want you to think about elders that can't get in their car and go to the site, or can't physically be there. We can show them on a tablet or a screen or something like that. That's kind of one of the visions that I have for this project. This is another rock that sits in that same collection. You can see the perforation lines from the cutting where they've drilled into it to separate it. And this is another one that we x-rayed. Now, what I found was interesting with this was, again, you've got designs like this one here, this one, there's information through there and there, and then over in this back corner here it gets a little bit hazy. Now, again, they recorded what they could see, but they forgot or didn't see the information that was sitting in between. Therefore, they've made perforation marks and they've literally cut the story in half. So the information now that is there is totally out of context. As with every other rock, there's nothing sacred about them at this point because they're all sitting isolated from their original context. This is an example of another one that we've just done. And why this work is so important is because these rocks are sitting out in the elements and they're slowly disintegrating. Nobody's maintaining them, nobody's looking after them. They're just exposed, a majority of them are exposed to the elements and left for whatever comes next. The other thing that we've been experimenting with in my practice is LiDAR. Now, everybody's got a mobile phone. Now, in your phones you have what's called LiDAR technology, and you're able to scan an artefact now and your phone recreates a rendering of that scan. And so I actually experimented with one of the rocks that I carved. And that's been actually quite successful. So with that, I'm able to gather more information, find more pieces of the puzzle, using this sort of technology, make it accessible for our community and our mob to see this for the very first time. As part of that, I've spent enough time with these rocks that I got really curious about the mark and how was the mark made. And so I've started to recreate from my experiences in sitting with some of these rocks and also too with the archives and working with sandstone and getting this complete picture of how this craft was done. And it's really amazing because there's so many different things that you think about to make a carving quite successful. Some of the lines in the carvings were this thick, and the only way you could get them that thick was if you had like a pick and you created a perforated surface down one edge and then down the other, and then you used another tool to pick the middle out of that, and that would leave you with this line, like that, the line with the emu feet attached to it. So there were many different ways of being able to carve. Also, it was more successful with some patterns if the stone was wet. It wouldn't quite work the way it needed to if the stone was dry. It would flake and break away, but if it was immersed in water, it was a lot more successful. And I got into my head as I was repeating and doing this over and over, I was thinking about what happens when we have a craft and we're sitting together as a community. And I had this image and I'm thinking, well, they wouldn't have done this in the middle of the day. They would have been sitting there probably late afternoon. It was cool, probably kids swimming in the water. Well, we don't know exactly what the function of the site is just yet, but there's many different layers to it. But you can imagine a group of men, old and young, and carving away and sharing stories and knowledge and looking at their landscape, their stars right above them. There's a carving in here because there's lots of associations with the emu. I haven't seen a physical representation of the emu, I've seen lots of footprints, but I'm not sure if anybody's familiar with the emu in the sky. I feel that some of these stories are a reflection of that. We're coming up to, in the middle of the year, you will see the emu stretched out right across the sky. We call it the coal sack, but for Indigenous people it was one of the most important constellations that was a signifier for lots of different things. So I encourage you towards the middle of the year, head on out to a cane field, get away from the lights, look up at the sky and give your eyes 30 seconds to adjust. The black space that sits in the middle of the Milky Way is the emu. And when he's stretched out right across the sky, we know that the emus are laying their eggs. So that is time to go and collect eggs, if that's what we need to do. It also has other signifiers, like times for initiation or ceremony. When that star formation is sitting at a certain point in the sky, it's time for those sorts of things to happen. The next step from that has been looking at this process of my experience and my impression of the archive. Now the thing is I've sat with these stones, I've looked at them, and I feel like I understand the absolute connection between people, landscape and the sky, and the function that that would have served. When you look at something that's been removed and it goes through this process of the archives, each step that happens, you're getting further and further away from the original intent of what the artefact is or was. So yes, these artefacts sitting in shelves in museums, they're really important to us, but believe it or not, they mean more to us in the location they came from and the stories they're telling than they do sitting in an institution in a dark shell. There's no point for them to be there. They need to live and breathe in their place. So that's what we're going to talk about with Beck in a minute. Is what I've been looking at is this removal from the artefact and making it basically as clinical and as flat, but also interesting as possible. And the way I've chosen to do that is with an art form of lithography. Again, it's an old art form. And what you do with lithography is I've carved the image, I've then photographed it, I've then taken it through a series of steps to get it to a plate. Then you have to backbreakingly roll this plate, and then you have to put paper on it, feed it through. There's a million different steps, and you get a beautiful print at the end of it. And that's pretty much what I'm starting to expand on now. There's a body of work that I'm working on with the lithography set, and the goal is in 2 years to make 94 prints. Each print is a symbol that reflects some of the work that I've looked at, but it also too is a homage to the story in itself. And the last conversation that I had with Queensland Museum, there are 4 rocks according to them unaccounted. So I feel that in that set of 94 prints, 4 of those pieces of paper need to remain blank. They'll be signed and editioned or whatever, but they'll just be blank pieces of paper. So eventually, by the end of this year, I'll have 94 prints, 4 blank pieces of paper to coincide with the research that I've done. And then I'm going to sell that back to an institution and see how they like it. Now the reason this is important, and I'm not going to go on this too much, is that as I was saying before, our sites are all connected. And one of the most important stories that we have is this migration from different mobs going to the Bunya Mountains Festival. Okay? Now that happened periodically over a few years, and the Bunya Mountains Festival was a place where you would connect, you would have ceremonies, you would have weddings, you would have, maybe not weddings, but you would gain a wife, Olympic sports, or our version of games, place to go and resolve conflict. All of this happened with different mobs at this place at this time to celebrate the coming of the Bunya Mountains. And there's places between here and there that are still being desecrated, and underhandedly as well. And to prove that point, again, I'm not going into this too much, but if you are interested in what's going on, I encourage you to take your phone out and point it at that QR link and look at that. So this is the part where I actually start to slow this down now, and I'm going to invite Rebecca back in, and we're going to talk more about our art.
Everyone's been quite, I think, spellbound by the story that we've launched.
That was the quick version.
It wasn't it? That was the quick version. Why are we telling what seems like a scientific, historical story in a gallery? What is this? Tell me about the art connection.
I think There's probably a couple of things to that. My family, especially my grandmother, they're creative in many different elements, different ways. Some of them are successful, have run their own successful businesses or consultancy or many different roles, but there's always been, for me, that element of creativity that's floated through our family. And the fact that that resonates so strongly with me here, I feel that this gallery is the safe space for me and a comfortable space, and it feels appropriate for me to have my work here and have it seen as part of the Bundaberg collection.
I think as a gallery we've spoken, as a gallery director and artist, we have spoken about this a lot. And you and I are actually heading to the National Galleries and Museums Conference in May, so we'll speak on a national level about the role of the gallery in being a platform for the story to be told. I think we have that conversation a lot about why it takes the artist to tell the story. Do you want to talk on that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So for those that don't know, Rebecca and I have had a working relationship now for a couple of years. And that conversation about me having my work here and how that was important, you know, Beck's been part of that journey pretty much the whole way. And I actually, I was telling Beck, I still remember it, sitting on the edge of my bed and saying, like, talking about this story and everything that happened around it, because it was like just sensory overload, emotional. I didn't know what was fact, I didn't know what was fiction. I actually felt like this story was way too big for me. And I just wanted to walk away. But then you said that thing where it was like, you know, win, lose, whatever. Isn't it amazing that it took the artist to tell the story? And for me, that was like, actually, yeah. I'm in a really unique opportunity here for me to be able to tell this story, because it might not actually be 100% correct. It may be, well, I can tell you it's not 100% correct, because there's so much more work to be done and it's at its infancy. But the thing is for me to be able to represent my community and represent my family and do it authentically and do it, you know, respectfully and do the best job that I can to make this story go wide, I feel like, you know, that's an important step to this thing that we call reconciliation or bridging the gap. It's making these stories interesting for everybody to come along for the ride. And that's what, we're not just talking about rocks and carvings in the rocks, we're talking about an archaeologist who, you know, was obviously distraught, and what that meant for her at that time. We've got this unique opportunity to look at look back at the politics and maybe see it through her eyes and her challenges and what was, you know, what went wrong and how do we improve on that, all those sorts of things, these conversations that still need to happen.
And I guess I really like what you said there about the fact that it is about reconciliation. It's about actually the artwork helps the story to be accessible. And I mean, that is the incredible thing about artists. And when any artist that I work with and any artist I've ever encountered, their practice is actually telling their story through their eyes. And that is really where you're going with this as well, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Like, I think art, in our culture, art is everything. That was how we articulated knowledge. That's how we shared knowledge. It was song, it was dance, it was relaying of carvings and paintings and all of those sorts of things. And that's, to be honest, that's something that we still struggle with. And I see it so strongly within the university. Like, I just finished my honours last year, and we're encouraged to follow the Western ideals of recording of knowledge and translating knowledge. I feel like half of that stuff I learned isn't applicable. Because for me, this is making sense through an arts practice that is collaborative with everybody. I feel like it needs to be fluid and needs to be able to change and manipulate and move and grow and shrink and do all of those sorts of things instead of being pigeonholed into a university degree pushed in a certain direction. And again, that's we have those conversations quite frequently within CAIA. and we're encouraged to do what we feel is right. And so far it's worked really well.
So you did say we have had association for a while. You first really engaged with the gallery back in 2019 when you came on board to...
Show your photos?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah, so in 2019 came on board on a contract basis. Prior to me being gallery director, but I was public programs officer at the time, and you were curating trade lines, which was the first Milby Festival, and the exhibition that the gallery was curating to sit alongside that. So that was your first experience with us, and not your last. Do you want to talk a little bit about how that sort of progressed in that trajectory, and how that relationship with the gallery has been part of that practice?
Yeah, to be honest, I think it was, when I thought about that, my course convener at the time was Bianca Beetson, and she just nonchalantly said, hey, I've got a gig for you back in Bundaberg if you might be interested. I'm like, yeah, sure, what is it? Oh, you've got to curate an exhibition. Oh, I haven't done that before. And then we came here and I was like, oh my God, what have I got myself into? But in saying that, I got a really good understanding of how galleries work. And galleries are just as, I feel like personally, and I don't think I've told you this before, but I think they're only as effective as the people that run it. People that have a sense of community with themselves within this gallery. And I got to see that, and I was like, actually, I really enjoyed that process. I got to work with Cherie, who taught me how to hang a picture. I got to run around with Tony at the very last minute because a certain king plate hadn't arrived, and then everybody was having a heart attack because there was a certain item not hanging up on the wall. There was our many conversations that we had together, and I felt a connection with another community, another place, and also too, galleries are really important because to me this place is like a storybook. All these blank walls, you're able to position and tell your story in a way that's interesting and engaging, and do it in a really classy way. I couldn't achieve that in my garage at home. Actually, I wouldn't like to try that. But the gallery is a really special place, and like I said, it's as important as important as the people that run it, and that those people support people coming into these spaces and allow them to be their true self. It was pretty good, actually. You haven't asked me that one before.
I haven't asked you that. We've done this a few times together, I should say. But yeah, I haven't asked you that one before. So I think, for me, I became gallery director in 2020, the year that we all want to forget, but anyway, it happened. And when I came in, it was quite a big role, and I had to really look at how we were going to really start to work in a positive way and tell our First Nation stories from this country in a way that was really reflective of community. And so you were fantastic in that. But what we also looked at a lot was the collection. So one of my jobs is to oversee the collection. And it had been a bit hodgepodge probably up until then. We hadn't really had a really strong direction anyways. But we started to look at the First Nations, and Dylan talking to our team a lot about petroglyphs and carving and printmaking. I got to spend time and still do at Kaya, so I've been very lucky to go and meet and work with alongside and work with here in the gallery a lot of their artists. So we started to look at printmaking. So we started to look, so now for us as a gallery, we recognise that the carvings were an early form of printmaking. So we've now developed into printmaking. So our First Nations collection focuses on contemporary First Nations printmakers, and that direction has come from the work and the relationship we've had with Dylan. And your works are in our collection. We do collect Dylan's works as well as other contemporary First Nations printmakers as well. But the first one we collected was 3 boomerangs, and then this piece, which is Let Me Speak. So this is a one-off. So you mentioned, you were sort of quite modest actually about you being a NATSIAA finalist. So the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Art Awards are one of the most significant awards in Australia for First Nations artists. And the first year you were part of that, you were one of 3?
Yeah, that's
one
right.
of 3 in Queensland,
yeah.
Which to even get as a finalist is very difficult. To be one of the 3 in Queensland is amazing, and that was with this piece here.
And then you thought maybe I'll go again. So you went in the second year.
Can I tell that story?
Yeah, you go. Your turn.
So for me, when I put this work in, it was just like win, lose, fail. I felt so good about it, and it was going. I just felt like it was the start of something. And then I got selected. I'm like, I knew it. I knew that was going to be part of it. Whether I won or lost, it didn't really matter. Just to get selected at that level was just an amazing achievement in itself. Now, there's a thing, when you're an artist, they encourage you, if you're going to do art prizes or you're going to do your degree, whatever, the key word is consistent. You've got to be consistent. You've got to keep rolling your artwork out. You've got to be making it seen, and competitions are a way of that to happen. Second year rolls around. I'm lying in bed. It's 11:30. I have my wife sitting beside me, and she said, "Oh, you haven't done your NATSIAA entry." And I was like, "No, I haven't got any." I can't believe I'm telling a story, but anyway. And she said, "No, you've got to put something in it." I'm like, okay. And I'd just come home from print, and I had all my test prints just scattered on my bedroom floor. And she said, "Put something in." I went, "Oh, this will do." I picked it up and entered it, and I got selected again. The work wasn't related to the Burnett River Rocks, but I just thought, like, again, it was kind of like maybe a little bit of self-validation or something. I was like, well, there's something going on here. There's a way that I can use this platform to tell this story even more effectively. And so, we tried again last year, and I got selected. I actually should have turned that up. So last year's work was called 1972, and what it was a snapshot of everything I'd sort of done up to this point. And I wanted to create a work that was gentle. In terms of a hard topic and hard conversations that have been had and are yet to be had and all the rest of it, I just wanted this to be like a gentle whisper and encourage people to come together to the table and say, hey, maybe there's another way to do this. And so the work I created was 1972. So the images that you saw before where I was sitting there with the muslin and the charcoal, I actually went back and found more pieces and collaborated it all together, and I created this work. And what it is it's all the rubbings, and it's 3 meters by 3 meters wide. It's really quite large. And the way that you read this work is it's covered in all the motifs that I uncovered. You've got a gather of material that's sort of sitting up on top of itself at the bottom. And then it comes up to a line, and the line has 1972, and there's a tear. Now, the way that reads is with the material that's on the ground, we don't know how much material is there. That signifies we don't know how much time has passed. But as that moves up, or as your eye goes up, you know that something happened in 1972. And I say that that's the year that our identity was torn apart. And so it was fitting to use fabric and material and to do that in that way. The lighting is really important as well. Like it becomes semi-transparent. Some things are quite visible, some things not so visible. But I remember Beck telling me that, what was it, the average time that somebody spends in front of an artwork is 17 seconds. And I use that consciously with every artwork that I do, is how do I make somebody stand here longer than 17 seconds? And the only way I feel I can do that is by not giving them everything. And making sure that you've got to stand there long enough to go, hang on a minute, that's what I saw, but I see something else. What's that all about? And then form connections in that way. And I actually had some really beautiful articles that were written up about this work, and how people that didn't really know too much about the story, but more about the presentation and the way that it was seen within the gallery space, they hit every note that I was trying to hit, which to me tells me that this work was really successful.
From that concept of the curtains is actually sort of gone further now, and the concept of the rubbings and showing those. So you are about to be showcased at the World Science Festival in Brisbane. If you visit the Queensland Museum, as of now, are they up now?
No, they're hung. They've been hung now, but I think it officially kicks off next week. I think so. Yeah, next week.
Yeah, it's next week.
If in doubt, just Google or science. Oh yeah.
So just to
come back to that. Yeah, so the work that I've got going up at the World Science Fair, I've been working along with my wife, who doesn't get enough credit for this
I was
job.
actually going to credit her too, so she does deserve it.
She's,
Trudy is the most patient woman I have ever come across in my life.
I don't think I couldn't. I definitely no. There's no doubt. I could not have pulled this off if it wasn't for her help. But what we've done is we've taken our rubbings. I've actually gone out and recreated more rubbings, or found more stones, and recreated them into these. It's actually canvas, but they look like, because they've been photographed of the material, they take on the nature of the material. So it's not this quite rigid. They actually look quite soft and delicate. And what we've done then is I've gone through and highlighted just some of the symbols, and then we're animating over the top. So what will happen is, this is a static image, but what actually happens is a line starts to appear within a design. And I've consciously made the line go in the same way or the format that the carving actually would have been done. It's not any random exercise of let's draw a line here, let's draw a line there. I've looked at the way that these marks have been carved and consciously followed my finger through to draw that line. And then over the top of that, we've actually got another animation of water just shimmering over the top of it. So there's 6 of these, so they stand at 4 point something high, 3 metres wide, and they basically take up a whole section of the walkway just outside of the museum. Where the whale is to the cafe at the back. I've got that whole area through there, so it's publicly accessible up until 8 o'clock at night or something.
And you are going for NATSIAA again this year, so
Yes.
you are.
So I'll go back to that. Well, there is actually there's a crowd favourite category there, so mind you, I've got to get selected. So this is the work that I'll be putting in. It's not actually this work. This is part of that 94 series. So what I'm actually putting in for this year is part 3. This is part 2 of that. So and I've done actually 6 frames across, so it covers a large section of wall. And it's that experience that I was talking about with the relationship between the artefact in situ versus the struggle of the archive. And that's what this work alludes to, talks about. Let me just share something else quickly. So this work here, just recently, as I was putting this together, there was a new discovery that I found that I hadn't previously seen. And there was a motif that popped up that looked like that. And I've actually just given the answer away. But initially when I looked at that and I showed that to a few other people, they're like, oh, it looks like an octopus or something like that, or some type of sea creature maybe. But again, that's the funny thing with these rocks, is you've got to look at them from all these different angles. You can't just look at a flat image from top to bottom. The actual shape of the rock and all those sorts of things are taken into consideration when they make these marks. And remember that story I was talking about with 3 boomerangs? To make that mark, they've actually used 3 boomerangs. And for me, that's the first time I've seen a record like that of our artefacts from here. So now we've got 3 different styles of boomerangs that have been used. So that says something again about a sense of place and identity, because not all boomerangs are the same either. Depends on what trees are available. It's cold, because boomerangs work with hot and cold air. So again, temperature, there's all these different factors. A boomerang isn't just a boomerang, and shape does matter. And to see that recorded like that and have 3 different styles of boomerangs was really, that was pretty exciting actually.
So I'm aware of time. We do want to have some question time at the end. but I'm going to ask you where to from here. So where's your next move for this?
I'm probably going to have to ask Trudy this one, to be honest. What's my schedule looking like? Where to from here? Well, I want to go back and do... Well, the interesting thing is when I stopped my honours, this project just kept going. So I committed to myself, I need a 6 months break just to sit still, soak in the last 3 or 4 years, and just get familiar with that, and then think about that question, what's next? To be honest, I haven't had a chance. This thing has got legs of its own, it's moving, there's breathing, there's all these different bits of information coming to light at different times. So I think it is fitting for me to just say screw it and go back and do my doctorate, because I'm doing it anyway. It's just that I get a fancy hat and a cloak at the end of it to say that I'm a doctor. But this work's really important, and I feel like if I'm setting the foundation for something to carry on, I'm just a link in a chain, or I'm just a conduit between me and the next person to get this up and get it to the elevation that it needs to be at. And if I can contribute to that in some way and somebody else can pick it up and run with it, hopefully a younger person within the community, then I feel like it's been a job well done. But short term, we're pushing for inclusion at the Toronto Triennial next year. And the reason I settled on that for Toronto is because their First Nation story over there, I'm not sure if anybody's aware, their story over there is identical to ours. Almost carbon copy. The issues that they face with mental health, alcohol, all those sorts of things due to the nature of colonisation, carbon copy. And I felt that that would be an amazing opportunity for me to go and share this story with them and form a bond across the ocean with something that we have in common, that is a beacon for hope. To know that, you know, we're not in this alone, but we're all in it together as a group of people in humanity. So there's that, and then I've got exhibitions. I don't know how many I've got now, but there's a few exhibitions popping up. But something that we've talked about is getting to a point with this research where I can take over this whole space and have my first solo show kick off here with this research. So that's something that I'm really looking forward to.
Thank you. And that, I'm going to open up for questions from the floor at this point. Does anyone have any questions for Dylan? Yes?
Dylan, the site's still there. It's under the water. There's a lot of technology that could go down there and have a look and see what's there. Is there any plan for that?
Yes. So, great question. This year I got to go to, in December, I got to go to an archaeology conference in Darwin. And it was a room full of archaeologists. And they asked me as an artist to go and present. And the feedback that I got from that, I presented a miniature version of this. I had people coming to me answering that initial question of surely there's technology here that allows us to do this better. And I met this guy who, trying to think of, like, in layman's terms, basically they come through and they survey, you can go to a site, they put all these rods and x-ray the ground and all that sort of thing, and they can actually take that information and develop it into a virtual reality scene as to what this site would have looked like with the information that's being fed into their program. They can recreate what it would have looked like 200 years ago, 400 years ago, 800 years ago. And that's something, like, I'd love for that to be, so that's got to be like a cross collaboration between universities, because he's University of Sydney. And that again is part of my doctorate, but that I feel like it would be so cool to have something like that in the works, or a sample of that for my solo show, and have that in there. Because like the idea I have is to create this sense of past, but also there's an element of future to that as well. And digital technology does have its place there, but it can sit hand in hand with traditional knowledges as well. And I think the only way we can do that is by going back and looking at country, recording it, bringing it into the virtual world, and just seeing what that looks like. It might suck, and we don't want to do it, but at least we can say that we tried, and we need to go down another path and try something else.
Any other questions? Trudy?
Or don't you ask me the hard one.
That's easy. Thanks.
Dylan, my question's in regards to the petroglyph site. How does it compare? Because 3.5 kilometres, if the size is massive, how does it compare to other petroglyph sites throughout Australia or Queensland or the East Coast?
Another great question.
Have you been able to find that out in your research?
So, at the time, there was a paper written called Obligations to Objects, and at the time that was starting to be pulled together by various people, it was known as one of the most significant sites down the east coast of Australia. Working in with archaeologists, and this is why I talk about that experience of our sites are all connected and linked. Andrea Gialadoni, who I work with, who showed me the photogrammetry, that's her job, is to travel around the country and document these sites. And there's some actually that she talks about in regional northwest Queensland, so northwest from here, along the mountain ranges, where I've shared some of this stuff with her, and she's seen some of the symbols portrayed in some of the work that she's documented. Again, she doesn't ask for the meaning or anything like that, and neither do I, but there is an association with iconography. And I can give you another example of that. I was in Perth last year or the year before, and the lithograph images in the grid, I actually had 3 or 4 of those up on display. And the gentleman that did the Welcome to Country, I was upstairs and he sought me out and he said, "Can you tell me more about this work?" And I explained it to him. He said, "What do you know about that symbol there?" I said, "I've got no idea." And he said, "Well, we've got a threshold just to the north of Perth. And it's where initiated young boys would come. They would be initiated. There would be a set of tasks that they would have to perform. Then they would have to pass through this threshold, and once they passed through there, they were men." He said, on the threshold where they crossed through, he said, "That symbol, we've got that here on our rock, on the other side of the country." So again, it's that association between this site and every other site, and then how does the icon connect all those sites together? So the short version is, this site is super significant. There are other sites around that are no more or less important than that one, but I feel that this one has a major connection to other major art sites through Queensland and Australia.
Yes.
Have these paintings, carvings been dated? And my other observation is, why did the First Nation people choose a riverbed? Can we imagine that the Burnett River was just a series of rock pools, and they must have known that rush or flowing water would erode? So I just visualise all the rock paintings I've seen are on the vertical, not
on the horizontal.
So it must have been a completely different river then.
And that's why I think it's super important for me to engage people like the guy I met up in Darwin, because you look at that bend in that river, it's super windy, but was it always like that? I'm not too sure. I mean, it's worthy of investigation. And that's probably one of the things I'm really excited about, because once we get a more accurate picture of what this landscape looked like 200 years ago, 300, 400, however long, probably we'll get a better sense of site function as well, and we'll get a better sense of how that's connected. Like there's even things like we've talked about, site function. Was it a place for men's business? Well, not too sure. Was it a place for women's business? Well, again, we're not too sure, because there are things that have been carved into those rocks that indicate both sexes. But also too, the archaeologists mentioned that talking to some people, that she said she remembers women bathing their baby in the rock pools. We've also had conversations with family where we've talked about mystery craters being a place for women as well. lots of interesting conversations. There's no real definitive answers yet, but I think, you know, the way that we're heading, I think we're heading in a really interesting direction for us to be able to better record these sites and better connect them through the landscape together as to potentially what did that look like.
That's why I feel that the main Burnett River took a different track than the rock pools.
Well, actually, it's interesting you say that, because I found there's a site just outside of Toowoomba, and it has the same thing. There were motifs on that site, on that rock ledge wall, that I'd seen here, to the point that I actually thought that they were photos from the same site. And I went, just curiosity got the better of me, and I went digging at that a bit more. And it actually talks about the river flow connecting from here all the way down to the Bremer, which is Brisbane and all those areas there. Now, if we think about water being the life source, so they wouldn't have navigated too far from water, but they were also the paths that they would have followed as well. Now, we don't have any record of the Burnett River and the Bremer River even connecting, but the evidence from a geological point of view, with lava tunnels and all that sort of stuff that has been looked at in other fields, without a doubt, these rivers were connected at some point. And along with that would have been pathways, and along with that would have been the artwork to articulate those pathways.
Any other questions? Sheree, you've got a big voice. I want you to throw the mic up there.
Dylan, so I would imagine that this investigation that you're doing would cost money. Have you tried at all to access any grants at all to assist you with this? Because it would be a big job.
When I hear the word grant, or grants, I short circuit. Because so far, my wife and I have self-funded every project that we've ever done. That's why, like, the doctorate thing appeals to me, because I can still maintain an income, but it also opens up doors for me to access funding, even though I struggle with it because it's all still fairly new ground for me. There are people there that are in positions to be able to help me with that. So it's one of those things where it is the ADD brain where I just go, I want to go this way and I'm going to go that way, and up the lot it is, that's what's going to happen. But I get humbled very quickly on that journey because I know that there are things that I can't do, and I know that grants are a way for me to be able to take this project to the next level. So that's something that we're looking at right now.
Any other questions?
Am I your favourite auntie?
Yes, you are my favourite. I have lots of favourites.
Lovely. Thanks, Dylan. Do you want to say anything to close it?
No, I think, so if there's no other questions, feel free to come and ask me if you don't feel like you want to do it in a public forum. I'm also accessible on Instagram, Facebook, flick me a message.
Tony's probably tagged you in a few slides.
Yeah.
Tony. So if anyone wants to follow Dylan's practice, you can follow him on Facebook and Instagram. Go and follow the galleries pages. You'll find Dylan tagged in tonight's events. So you can go on and follow him from there.
And again, I just want to say a massive thank you for everybody coming along tonight to hear the story. Again, it was a great honour, privilege for me to be able to share this with friends and family, and this is only the start of it, so let's wait and see what happens next. Thank you.
Thanks, Dylan, for coming up to talk tonight. Thank you to everyone for coming along to tonight's event. I'm sure you will go away and contemplate what you've heard tonight and think about a lot more. We are really lucky at the gallery to have a lot of contact with Dylan, so please do follow our socials as well to see when other things are coming up with him. Thank you. Have a great evening.